All right, now Jon Mackay.
Okay, thank you. So my talk today is on changing patterns of international trade, in particular declining economic complexity in Canadian exports. So just as a quick outline of the talk, I'm going to define this measure of economic complexity. This is a quantitative measure that's been developed by researchers in economic development at the Center for Economic Development at Harvard University, working with some other scholars at MIT, Hausman and Hidalgo. And it's a measure that they've found to be predictive of future economic growth. The particular interest of this talk is these scholars have devised an index or a scoring or ranking system, basically, of countries using export data over a period of 50 years. And so their idea is to get a sense of which countries are developing sort of rare goods and which are developing high-value products. And this measure of economic complexity captures that. Now, unfortunately, Canada has recently declined in this measure, in this index, over the past, it's been fairly stable for about 40 years, and recently there's been a steep decline. And so that's the real focus of this talk. And so I'm going to submit some likely reasons for this, and hopefully we can talk about that some more as the day goes on. But first, I wanted to define or at least give an intuitive definition, sorry, I have to set that down, about what economic complexity is. And I think the easiest way to think about this is as a form of knowledge embedded in products, if you will. So for example, if I cut down a tree and dry out the wood and eventually sell that wood, there's not a tremendous amount of know-how or knowledge embodied in that action. Though if I try to create an engine or an iPad or something of that sort, I have to rent a factory, I have to get skilled people there, I have to get skilled engineers and skilled tradesmen, et cetera, et cetera. All of those people involved in that process have a tremendous amount of knowledge. And we can think about this product as not being easily replicable in many different economies. So there's only a select number of economies that can actually produce a very complex product like an engine or an iPad, for example. So with that intuition in place, I wanted to show you this decline. So this is the ranking. This red line indicates Canada's position in the ranking over time. In the top left corner, 1 is obviously the best place to be, the first position. And along the horizontal axis, we have export data ranging from 1963 to 2016. And this is what we're going to be using throughout the talk. And you can see Canada has largely been in the same position over the past 40 years. That's somewhere between the 20th and the 25th position, with some variation, but generally speaking, the trend has been fairly consistent until about 2008, when there's been a sharp decline, and Canada dropped down to the 40th position in this ranking. There's been a slight uptick in recent years, but still nowhere near where we were on this trend. And so this is a stacked graph of the things that Canada has exported over the past 50 years. And I thought a reasonable place to start to answer this question, or start answering this question, was to look at our largest exports. So in this case, along the vertical axis, this is just billions of US dollars, and the horizontal, again, time period from 1963 to 2016. In particular, I'm going to focus on petroleum from bitumen and automotive manufacturing and the related auto parts manufacturing industries. So, oh, all right. And it's worth noting that there's a slight difference. I don't know if you can see on these slides, but there's a difference between these two industries, not only in what they produce, but in what other industries also export along with them. So what these two visualizations show, on the one hand, on the right-hand side, is crude petroleum, the industry we're going to follow, but you can see it's a major exporter, but there's not many other industries that export along with it. To be sure, it's an important employer, it's a source of good paying jobs, but it does not, in and of itself, support a lot of other industries that also export. On the left-hand side, or the blue dot rather, on your right, is the automotive manufacturing industry. And you can see circling around that, perhaps very faintly, other nodes, and those represent other industries that also export, and so they are associated with exporting in countries when there is a robust auto manufacturing sector. So that's a key difference in sort of intuitive complexity, if you want to think of it that way. So if we're interested in this drop in economic complexity, and we have this intuitive idea about what it is, and what we need to do is look at how both petroleum exports and automotive exports have performed over time. And this is something that's been brought up a few times now. So we want to get a sense about how Canada's comparative advantage has changed over time. So what we can do is create a very simple measure of comparative advantage, and that is for any particular industry, we can look at the percent of that object or that product that Canada exports divided by the world average, right? So that'll give us a very simple, straightforward measure, if you will, or a ratio. For example, if 15% of Canada's exports are in lumber, but the world average is 10%, then Canada has a revealed comparative advantage, if you will, of 1.5. So the idea here is anything, a revealed comparative advantage greater than 1 is good, and we're good at exporting that product. Anything below 1 means we're below average in doing that particular thing. So again, this is just a heuristic, if you will. I hope you can see this. So I wanted to look at our two industries. This is the petroleum industry from bitumen, and you can see there's a black line here, which is 1. And this point, above this point, means that there's some sort of comparative advantage in that industry using our heuristic. And so along the vertical axis is that RCA measure. And the horizontal, again, is years from 1963 to 2016. And so you can see in the late 1990s, the comparative advantage with petroleum has just taken off. It just skyrockets. It's very clear that likely a number of things came together. There was the world oil price was probably at a good point. There's been a lot of work and research and development to actually extract the oil efficiently, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of things came together in that. Now, if we look at auto manufacturing and the associated parts industry, we'll get a slightly different story. We can see the comparative advantage takes off post the signing of the Auto Pact Agreement. Right now we want to look at the red line, and we can see there's clearly an advantage in automotive manufacturing. There's a comparative advantage there. Certainly there's some variation, but generally speaking, it follows over time, and there's clearly a comparative advantage. The blue line is particularly interesting in that this is an aggregation of auto parts manufacturing industries, though I've aggregated them just for this visualization. If we separate them, the trend is the same. But the point here is that here too, there appears to be a comparative advantage over time, certainly a lot of variability, but once we approach the 2008 point, in the financial crisis, there's a sudden drop-off, and we remain well below what I would say is having a comparative advantage in the parts manufacturing sector. So what are some of the reasons for this decline? I don't, especially in this room, I don't feel qualified to necessarily say, so I know we have a number of experts who will no doubt correct me, but from what I've read in the literature, there were a number of issues going on, some more important than others perhaps, consolidation of suppliers, loss of some of vehicle assembly capability, some southward shift of production. But what I thought was most interesting was a quote that, well, this isn't a direct quote, but the idea was that there was a lack of attention by policymakers to the diverse network of parts manufacturers. And the comment, I believe, was that there was more emphasis being placed on particular firms rather than the industry as a whole. So some of the causes and implications of this, I think there are two basic causes just by looking at these two large export industries for the decline in economic complexity. First of all, petroleum itself, relatively speaking, it's a simple industry. It's not, insofar as this measure goes, it's a simple industry. And it's an industry that we're extremely competitive in, so it would account for much of this drop. Also, auto parts are much more of a complex industry by this measure. So there's lots of products that are hard to reproduce by many different economies. And again, we've fallen in competitiveness in this industry. So the measure itself, more of a complement to existing measures and not so much well, it's a complement to existing measures, I think, in that it takes into account the fact that there's interrelationships between these industries that need to be taken into account. As for implications for the USMCA and the midterm elections, I think that's something to discuss going forward. Thank you very much.